Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm Peri Nase, founder and CEO of Me Time Healing. I have Dr. Swati Chanani here with me. She's one of our medical advisors. And today we are honored to speak with her. And she is one of those leaders who bridges evidence-based care with cultural understanding. And today we'll be exploring how culture shapes our emotions and our mental well-being. Welcome, Dr. Chanani.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ferry. Really excited.
Want to talk a little bit about this topic just as a start, and then we'll dive into our questions?
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I think, the topic of mental health and cultural identity are very, very intricately linked. How we think about our cultural identity, how others kind of view us when they see us, it's very linked to how we navigate the world. And I think there's of cultural identity on mental health. So I think it's just really important for practitioners to think about, but also for individuals to think about when they're interacting with the mental health care system. So yeah, really excited to talk about it today.
How does the cultural identity influence the way individuals experience and express mental health and mental well-being?
Yeah.
I,
And
I, I feel like it has profound, effects on people's wellness.
yeah, definitely. And I think there's, every culture kind of has their own ways in which they practice wellness and they define wellness, and wellness can look very different from culture to culture. And so, as an individual, the way you think of wellness could be very different than someone from another culture, right? In a lot of cultures, right, being with family, being very social, caring for others can be a form of wellness. And in other cultures, it can be more about kind of spending time alone and self care in that way. And so, when you're thinking about just what wellness even means, it varies a lot culture to culture. And then thinking about how figure out if you are doing mentally well or not can also kind of vary from culture to culture. Some cultures might normalize stress and anxiety more than other cultures do. And I think probably all cultures have done that over time. And so people might sometimes self-minimize what they're feeling and just saying, well, this is just, this is just part of life, or this is just kind of what it is, because that's what their culture has taught them to do.
In your clinical experience, what are some common misconceptions mental health providers might have when they're dealing with various clients?
Yeah, I think sometimes people have misconceptions about kind of assuming that all people from minority cultures have a lot of stigma towards mental health. And I know we're going to talk about stigma, and that certainly does a lot with kind of experience the mental health care system. But I think sometimes practitioners assume anyone from a minoritized background, is anti-psychiatric treatment or anti-therapy, or their families might be against treatment. And that's not always the case. And I think often, people coming from minority backgrounds are really open to these things. They just might be a little more skeptical. They might have a little bit more reservations, but they're actually really open and wanting to talk about it. They might just do it differently. So assuming that they completely stigmatize it or don't want to talk about it can be a big misconception. Um, I think another misconception can sometimes come in the way of, and we're going to talk about diagnosis, but I think sometimes assuming certain traits, um, they sometimes assume certain traits are related to cultural identity and like miss certain kind of diagnoses, right? They might have a stereotype that people from this background behave in this way, and that might cloud some of like their clinical judgment. So I think sometimes being aware of those kinds of just biases that are very natural and can happen can be really, really useful when you're working with someone that has a different cultural identity than yourself.
Can you speak to the psychological impact of being part of a marginalized or minority group in a dominant culture?
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies about this, and there's a lot of stress when you are a minority in a culture that is different than the culture you have at home. And then there's a lot of stress with immigration, right? Often when we're talking about minorities, we're talking about immigrants, and there is an extreme amount of stress that comes from immigration, having to acculturate. And so we actually know that there are, higher rates of things like PTSD, anxiety, depression in immigrants, but even things like schizophrenia, like really hardcore psychiatric illnesses, there are higher rates in immigrants than in the general population. And that does seem to be correlated to stress because there's even higher rates amongst like refugees than kind of like voluntary immigrants, right? So we know that the stress of it can have a huge, huge impact on people's kind of psychological well-being, and then for developing, very serious kind of mental health diagnoses as well.
I really connect with that because I'm an immigrant.
Mhm.
I'm a Turkish American. And when it comes to really understanding, really diving deep, you really need to connect with that culture. So, and if you cannot connect, then educate yourself about that culture, right? So it's a lot of responsibility when it comes to really taking care of that client or a patient. So it's for the providers, it's also very interesting, I would say,
Yeah.
interesting to understand the layers and layers of history,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate your, honesty there. So, from a neuroscience or psychiatric perspective, how do you unacknowledged cultural stressor impact mental health over time?
Yeah, and so, there's also been definite studies that for folks who experience more stress related to, being a minority group or being an immigrant, that there are actually brain changes associated with this, and brain changes that we often see with people who experience kind of more trauma and more stress. Right, so we actually know there are biological impacts of having to experience all of this stress.
And does that kind of affect their lifestyle, or does it make their lifestyle harder? It's not just the neurologic state of mind. It's also how it reflects on their lifestyle, and improving their lifestyles. Because when you're an expat, the idea is to improve your life, right? To open yourself to all these new ideas, all these new history, new knowledge. So all of that is overwhelming.
Yeah,
On top of that, if you're being subject to cultural avoidance, it's very stressful. It's
yeah.
very, yeah. For me it was, and I'm talking about my personal
Yeah.
experiences, but I can understand how your stress level can exceed the uh, you know the level that you can actually process.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's challenging for both sides.
Yeah. Well, and I think kind of the point you bring up too, right, is that there's often a lot of resiliency amongst, kind of folks who identify as minorities, and particularly as immigrants, right? Like, I think there is a lot, you're facing a lot of stress and a lot of challenges. And then a lot of these people actually, when we're talking about lifestyle, do end up doing like learning to adapt to all that stress and learning to overcome it, and they do find a way to be very resilient and and like eventually succeed. And I think then kind of coming full circle, then what happens then to their kids, right? I think their kids are minorities. They're not immigrants. um and I think one thing I see a lot with like kids of immigrants, right, is like sometimes their parents might minimize the stressors that their kids are going through because they're like, well, I went through so much worse, right? And I did so much worse, and you should be grateful for what you have. And I think those kids are grateful, but they are still experiencing a lot of challenges, right? They are still a minority, and they really do still need a lot of support. So
So, how does cultural context influence diagnostic accuracy in psychiatry, particularly in disorders like depression, anxiety, PTSD? Everybody's talking about that. Menopause. There's so much. So many things get affected. So, how do you see that in your clinical, observation?
yeah, and I think it's important to know that, like, people from cultures different than yours might sometimes express certain symptoms slightly differently, right? And so like something like anxiety, might be expressed differently based on what culture you're in. Anxiety is one of these things where it can get expressed in a lot of different ways, and often the diagnosis of it is saying like, oh, look at like all these things you're talking about, this is anxiety, right? And so being kind of familiar with how are these things expressed in different cultures, and then also kind of like what is normal in other cultures, right? One example I always like to give is something like hallucinations, right? We think of hallucinations as a significant psychiatric symptom, right? And a mental health practitioner hears hallucinations and they start to think of very serious things. And yet there's a lot of cultures in which like after the death of a loved one, it is somewhat normal to like hear the person who has passed away or even like see visions of the person who has passed away, and that's considered part of normal grieving. And if someone wasn't aware of that, they could give them a misdiagnosis, right? And so I think it's important to know kind of just cultural norms around kind of how things are expressed.
Yeah. In actually, it creates a great connection, right?
Hmm.
Because it's all about connection.
Yeah.
And then, once you understand where they're coming from and what they have lived throughout their lives,
Yeah.
it creates that very strong bond,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about access and empathy in care, and I really care about that topic.
Yeah.
That's my baby.
Yeah.
So, why do you think stigma around mental health is higher in some cultures, and how can we respectfully address that?
Yeah, and I think there's a few reasons, right? I think there are certainly cultures in which mental health is not talked about as much, and so there's just stigma around things that are not talked about. Certainly, mental health and psychiatric conditions um, have taken longer for science to understand, right? Like as a scientific community, it's taken longer to understand how these things work, how they manifest. And so sometimes when there's less understanding of things, people stigmatize them, right? Because they don't know where it's coming from. Um, when someone has high blood pressure, you see the number on the blood pressure monitor. It's really easy, right? To say, okay, high blood pressure, it's coming from your heart. This is what's going on. Something like depression is a lot harder, right?
Yeah.
To point
It's
to it.
not black and white.
Yeah, it's not black and white. I think a lot of stigma comes from that. And then I think another part of the stigma is kind of worry about being different all in another way, right? If you're a minority, you're already different. And then you
Mhm.
don't want another label on you that's different. I have talked to um, immigrants who were worried about getting mental health care because they thought they would then lose their visas, or they would, like it would
Lose their
somehow,
job.
yeah, lose their jobs, right? Like it would put some kind of mark on them, right? So they're kind of worried about anything that might come off negatively, right? Because that they're worried about how that's going to be perceived. So that sometimes prevents them from seeking care.
So, how do you see the future of that? I mean, how are we going to normalize this? How are we going to kind of uh, uh, open up and say, this is everybody is experiencing this, not just immigrants. I mean, everybody is experiencing something. So how do you see the future of this kind of unfolding?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of ways, right? I think like people being more open, talking about their own experiences, I think is really important, particularly people with a lot of social power, right? So like celebrities or right, people who have a lot of people listening to them, being very open, talking about their own experiences and like raising awareness, I think that can help normalize things a lot. Um, I also think having, like primary care doctors, like kind of make these things part of like standard visits, standard questions they ask. It's, just like asking about, like your diet or your exercise, they're going to ask about your mental health, right? If they just approach it like anything else, I think it really helps kind of normalize it, bring more awareness. And then I think just improving.
Has your own cultural background influenced the way you practice?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, right? So my parents are immigrants from India, and so while I was born and raised here, I mean that had a strong impact on my identity and still does. And I think it helps me connect with families that are kind of in a similar position. I can often understand, I think, just family dynamics in like immigrant households because of that. I think it just gives me a different perspective. I think I can also just understand, um, just yeah, how folks might feel being in a minority situation. So I think it allows me to connect with my patients and just have a lot more empathy for folks who are in a similar situation.
So if you could give one piece of advice to a mental health provider
Yeah.
who is working in a multicultural setting, what would that be?
It would be to just ask someone how their culture has impacted them and impacts their life, rather than making assumptions about it or being too scared and like avoiding it. Just ask them when you first meet them, how has this been? How would you describe your cultural identity? And like, how has it impacted your life? How do you think it's impacting, the reason you're coming in to see me?
Mhm.
People will give you a lot of information if you give them the opportunity to talk about it.
There are always layers and layers of culture. Even one culture is not just simply one culture.
Yeah,
So every culture is influenced from different cultures.
yeah.
So, and I want to, talk about my culture. I mean, the Turkish culture is influenced from, their neighbors from Asia, from India, from Iran, from Russia, from the Eastern culture. So there's a lot of Bulgarians live in Turkey. So when it comes to all this, there's actually a great harmony. I mean,
Mhm.
there's already a great understanding of culture, and it's beautiful. I mean, you want to learn about different foods. You want to learn about, you go out. You're like, oh, I already know Turkish food. I want to try Indian food. So people are curious. So
Mhm.
how do you reflect that curiosity and that uh, understanding to a clinical setting? How can that be that how can that be appreciated in a clinical setting? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like you're saying, just being curious, right? So I think when you're working with people from different backgrounds, being curious about what, what their like kind of lived experience of their culture has been, right? Does it impact, yeah, the food they eat, what they do for fun, just yeah, what was their relationship like with their parents, right? Like just be really curious about it and it's culture is something that is so immersive, right? It really like kind of grosses your life, and then like you're saying, right, like culture is very dynamic as well, right? Like and so just being kind of mindful of that and just being very curious about it. Yeah.
So I want to also ask if you have any questions, you can leave it in the chat and we will get to it at the end. So I also am curious about the future. of mental health. So there's a lot going on with AI. There's a great influence or like a wave coming. And what are your prediction for the cultural understanding coming from machine learning, and how is that going to reflect on practicing psychology or psychiatry in the
Yeah,
future?
yeah. And I think this is one of
It's
these
a, I know it's a very sensitive subject, but let's dive into it. Why not? I think it's
things.
an interesting
Yeah,
subject.
I mean, I think I think there can be a lot of like fear, right? When people talk about AI and worry, but I think there can be a lot of like benefits that we can embrace, right? Um,
Yes.
and I think, you can use AI to kind of enhance what you're doing, right? So have it aggregate data for you when you're trying to figure out how to work with someone from a different culture, right? It might help you give you some talking points if you're struggling. Like you could pose a question, say, I'm struggling to connect, with this family. Here's a bunch of things about them, what might help me connect with them. And they, can provide consultation. You don't have to take it if you don't like it, right? But it can provide that. Um, I think one thing that's nice, we just want to talk about technology as a whole, not just AI, is
Yeah.
how much we've been able to do things online, which I think is really, really great for minorities, right? I think having these kind of online platforms for receiving care, right, really helps people. They might be able to find a practitioner who identifies similarly as them, and that can just make a huge difference in care. And so I think having more technology, I think, actually improves access. So I think even though people worry about it, I think it really just really helps improve access, and you could really use it as a tool to kind of like refine your skills.
And how do you see the risk management there? Is everybody's talking about when you're in medical industry, everybody's talking about risk management and liabilities. And what are your thoughts about that for the future of behavioral health?
Yeah, well, and I think that that really lies on like the AI companies, right? I think there's definitely been stories of people using ChatGPT to figure out how to like commit suicide or something, right? And I think so that definitely is something right before people, right? I don't think we're in a place where like AI is going to like replace providers, right? A provider would never do something like that.
Mhm.
So I think that's their responsibility to figure out how to make sure they're not doing things like that, and that they are providing, like kind of they're being careful about what information is popping up,
Yeah.
particularly to kids and younger
Yeah.
people. And yeah,
Yeah, they're the most vulnerable. Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to see if anyone has any questions. At this point, we're gonna start wrapping up.
Hmm.
Feel free to drop your questions in the chat box, and we can perhaps wrap up the session. So interesting things are happening, and not just in business and innovation technology, but interesting things are happening in medicine. And the future is going to be very. I can't wait to see how AI reflects on mental health awareness, first of all, and mental health, behavioral support. So, thank you so much, Dr. Chinani, for joining us, and I truly appreciate your knowledge and your wisdom. This session was recorded, so we're going to share this with everyone who attended, and if you have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to answer them. So we're not just building access to care, we're reimagining it with cultural understanding and is at its core. Thank you everyone for being part of our community and for being on this journey with us. We appreciate your time and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Ferry, for having me.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care, doctor.